Good afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today. We have two fantastic speakers queued up for you. My wonderful boss, Chris Costa, will be leading the conversation. He's the Executive Director of the museum. And he's joined today by Army Lieutenant General Robert Ashley Jr., who retired as Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency in October of 2020. Lieutenant General Ashley became DIA Director in October 2017. He formerly served as the Army Deputy Chief of Staff, G2, where he was the Senior Advisor to the Secretary of the Army and Army Chief of Staff for all aspects of intelligence, counterintelligence, and security. Ashley is a career Army military intelligence officer with assignments in the United States and Turkey and deployments to many operations, including Operation IRAQI Freedom in Iraq and Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. He has commanded at the company, battalion, squadron, as a squadron brigade commander and J2. You have so many incredible merits. It's hard for me to keep up even just reading them. His awards and decorations include the Defense Superior Service Medal, Legion of Merit, and Bronze Star Medal. And when Bob retired, he received the National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal for dedication to the intelligence community throughout his career. So Chris and Bob are each going to talk about the issues that are weighing upon them or intriguing them or disturbing them or cheering them up. Maybe there's something cheerful today, who knows? And then we're going to turn the program over to your questions. So before I stop talking and turn this over to the people you've tuned into here, I want to share a very, very special thanks with our fantastic sponsor. Once again, it is Accenture. Accenture Federal Services has been a continuing supporter of the Spy Museum for Spy Chat and other things. We really can't express how important this has been to us as we weather this new strange pandemic world that we are in. And we want to extend special thanks to our governing board member, Tracy Easler, and to Lieutenant General Mary Legere for championing this support. We really cannot thank you enough, and I hope everybody joins me in the audience in feeling grateful for them enabling us to do this. So enough from me, over to someone who's got some really interesting things to say. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Amanda. As always, thanks for the great introduction. This particular program really excites me because not only is Bob Ashley a lifelong friend in the military, but he's also a leader that I would follow anywhere. I served in some of the same assignments that Bob did, and he did an extraordinary job leading DIA. But long before that, I had an opportunity to get to know Bob and his family. So I am particularly grateful that you're here today, Bob. So I'm really excited about our program. And I also want to thank again Accenture before we kick this off. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into the first story that I'm tracking. And many of you are familiar with this story because we talked about it in the last couple of years, but it's come to a head, so to speak. The Saudi Crown Prince, of course, Mohammed bin Salman, recently a DNI report, so an Office of the Director of National Intelligence, released a long-awaited declassified report that assessed that MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is not only complicit, but he directed the killing of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Well, that is not a surprise because much of this has leaked in the last couple of years. What may be a surprise to some, but we will see how this plays out in regional politics. But the current administration, the Biden administration, has elected in the short term not to sanction MBS. So that is not inconsistent with the way the United States has handled world leaders for the most part. Generally, leaders in the position that MBS is are not sanctioned. There are exceptions, of course, like the North Korean leader. So moving on to the next story, this will take you back to the Cold War. Newly released documents from 1983, a year before I was commissioned, talks about a CPX, a command exercise that played out during the Cold War in Europe, in NATO. And the exercise was a command post exercise. That's what a CPX stands for, to coordinate, to exercise communications, to make sure you could coordinate with your subordinate units. Back in 1983, the Soviet Union picked up exactly the wrong signals. They thought that exercise was a ruse. And according to these archival documents that were released, they ramped up their alerts, and Soviet planes were loaded up with nuclear weapons in East Germany. And we, at the time, did not recognize, we being the West, how close we came to a nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union as a result of unintended consequences of having an excellent exercise that was picked up by the Soviet Union that was thought to be a ruse and not an exercise at all, but a first strike capability by the West. So it really reconfirms the idea that there were scares during the Cold War. Washington Post reported it, and I think it's an important article in the last couple of weeks that really gets to the heart of miscalculations from a national security standpoint. Certainly scary. All right, switching gears a little bit to a counterintelligence story that I am tracking that I find particularly interesting. The Ethiopian security services disrupted a cell of 15 Iranians that were planning to attack the Emirati interests in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. This is a result, more than likely, that the interests were going to be the Emiratis, as I stated, and this is a result of the Emiratis warming their relationships with Israel. A 16th individual was arrested in Sweden. So in short, and to sum up, we have an Iranian network of operatives that were ready to attack Emirati interests on the ground in Ethiopia and probably elsewhere in Africa, to include the Sudan. It seems, according to the New York Times, that the Foreign Intelligence Service of Israel, the vaunted Mossad, was involved with some of this disruption. So a fascinating escalation. It shouldn't be surprising to our audience because we have talked in the last few years about the worldwide attack capabilities of Iran should they choose to activate some of their networks globally. The next story is related to something we have come back to thematically in the last couple months, and it has to do with the German Domestic Intelligence Service, the BFV, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution in Germany. Evidently, the BFV was very concerned about far-right extremists in a legitimate political party. So they were getting ready to ramp their surveillance up of this opposition party. And it leaked and it was taken into the court system in Germany, in Cologne. So we will see how this story plays out, but it just underscores the notion of far-right extremists. And where are those lines? When does a political party cross a line to become dangerous to a country's constitution? In this case, it's an international story. We're talking about the Republic of Germany. The next story that I think is really important, I think most of you are tracking, that the United States conducted a proportional retaliatory strike against a Iranian-backed militia group on the border between Syria and Iraq. And this is a result of the militia group firing rockets at US coalition forces in Erbil, Iraq. Not only was it proportional, it seems to me that this was done in consultation with the Iraqi government, and it seemed to be a strike that was not escalatory in nature. It was proportional to the threat. We will see how this plays out in the future, the tit for tat between the United States and Iranian surrogates in the region. The next story underscores something we have also talked a lot about, but I feel remiss if I don't cover domestic violent extremism. As a result of yesterday's released another DNI, Director of National Intelligence report, was declassified and shared with the world, and it underscores the nature of the threat with regard to domestic violent extremists here in the United States. The threat is pervasive. It's a concern, militia movements and lone actors responding by violence directed at the United States government. So the Biden administration promised an early assessment. The DNI produced that assessment. I know the actors that are working on some of the policy implications at the National Security Council. We'll see how this plays out regarding policy outputs, but that's the intelligence. We have something here in the United States to be concerned about. The next story, I like to talk about detainee or hostages stories. Interestingly enough, I think the Biden administration is going to find the problem of Guantanamo prison is going to be a vexing problem for them, as it was for some of us in the Trump administration, and even before that, under the Obama administration. In short, there are about 40 detainees that are at Gitmo Bay in Cuba. Those individuals, some of them are awaiting trial. Some of those individuals will be repatriated to North Africa. The Biden administration is assessing, can they in fact close down Guantanamo Bay? They are very short on details, but they appear to be assessing it. I will tell you, I've been to Guantanamo Bay several times, to include once as a policymaker, and it is a tough problem because we cannot move those detainees to the United States because law prohibits it. We can't even, the United States now, we can't even provide medical support in the United States for detainees. So very unique and specific medical support needs have to be flown out to Guantanamo Bay. It's a significant cost to the US government. That said, the administration apparently is looking at options. Another detainee story we have talked about for a couple years now, and it has to do with detainees that are being held on the ground in Syria still. The particular detainees I want to talk about for a moment is reporting in the New York Times about French women, ISIS affiliated because they married ISIS fighters. They left France to join ISIS, and they are now in detainee camps. They will not be repatriated to France. So they are currently, I believe there are somewhere between 10 and 14 are undergoing a hunger strike to cause attention to their plight. What do they want? They want to be repatriated back to France. They want to face justice in France. Whereas the French government, despite the hunger strike, at least in the short term, is intent on letting them face justice in courts in Iraq. So we'll see how that plays out as the hunger strike continues. As far as I know, it has been continuing for a couple weeks now. All right, from a macro standpoint, from a national security standpoint, the Biden administration also reversed, or it seems it is undergoing a reversal of some Trump policies by publishing, the first time I've seen such a document, an interim national security guidance document that says, hey, we're not going to publish our national security strategy, but what we want to do is signal the direction of our foreign policy. So it's an interesting document. I think it's an important document. It's interim, as I say, and it really underscores the notion that this administration wants to focus its efforts on international alliances, and it wants to focus on strengthening democracies globally. And really, it's a rebuff, some have argued, for an American first strategy, and it's what President Biden has seemingly talked about, and that is an America is back strategy. So we'll watch that play out. It is far too early to assess kind of where we are, where the United States is from a foreign policy standpoint, but I think that's an important document. And the last point I want to focus on, and this is fun. So Amanda said I would talk about something sort of kind of fun. Well, to the extent that I can, I will just offer an interesting book recommendation. It will take you back to World War II, the heady days of the intelligence battles that played out in the Middle East. I think it's an important book. It reads like a Le Carré novel in some parts. I really enjoyed it. The title is War of Shadows: Code Breakers, Spies, and the Secret Struggle to Drive the Nazis from the Middle East. So that's not an entirely light subject, but it certainly harkens back to what seemed like a simpler time, albeit still lethal. Fun book to pick up and read through pretty quickly. The author is Gorenberg. We'll post that, I think, in our notes. But thank you very much. I'm going to kick it over to Bob. I'm anxious to hear his thoughts today. Bob, over to you.
Hey, Chris. Hey, thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody from the Spy Museum. Always good to see you and Donna, and really thanks for what you do to keep our history alive, and we greatly appreciate that. Let me say thanks also to Accenture for what you guys do, for what you do to sponsor these events. Absolutely critical, and lots of teammates that I have down there, both Mary, John, and George, and look forward to linking up with you guys later. So let me take about 15 minutes. What I want to do is kind of give you the framework of what I think about on a daily basis, what I'm reading, what I'm following. And I think that'll be broad enough in context that it'll generate lots of questions. So let me start with the problem statement. So like with any good analysis, you want to make sure you got a good problem statement. And Einstein once said, if I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend the first 55 minutes defining the problem, and I'd spend the last 5 minutes saving the world. And so as we think about kind of the geopolitical world that we're in right now, it's absolutely critical that we are solving the correct problem that we defined, and that we're working on the same, kind of the same vectors. If you go back and you look at the National Defense Strategy, and the central problem that's in the National Defense Strategy is our military advantage is eroding. Okay, so set that aside for a second, because that's kind of the M and the dime of the instruments of power. But the problem that we really have to solve, that larger problem at the strategic level, is one that's across all the instruments of power: diplomatic, information, military, and economic. So as I think of the larger context of the dime problem, of which the NDS is part of that, I would put it into how do we sustain the current rules-based world order of democratic values to foster prosperity among nations and prevent great power war. So that's a mouthful, but how do we continue kind of the world order, the rules-based values order that's been in place since World War II? And kind of what we have today, I would describe, it's a little bit of Newtonian physics and the law of motion, and it is a physics problem. And so you look at the path that we're on right now is a physics problem, and a body in motion tends to remain in motion unless there's some energy that's applied against that path. And so there's a lot of concern right now that the path that we're on, juxtaposed against the path that China on, is one that puts that rules-based order in risk. And so we have to talk about how we apply energy to make corrections. So globally, if you're a political scientist, you think about this in polarity, right? So the unipolar moment that kind of came when the wall fell has passed. And right now I really see us in a multipolar world. So, but what kind of world is that going to be? Is it going to be balanced? Is it going to be unbalanced? Because the political scientists will tell you, if you have an unbalanced multipolar, then you start building a framework for instability. And if you've had a chance to read it, Graham Chapman wrote a phenomenal book called Destined for War. And in the book, what Graham does is he kind of unpacks the Thucydides trap, where you have a reigning and a rising power, which goes back to the time of the Peloponnesian War, where you have a reigning Sparta and a rising Athens. And so what Graham does is he lays out 16 different case studies, 12 of which end in conflict, in those kind of unbalanced polarity, where he takes you through, and it's really lessons learned. And the reason Graham wrote the book was kind of an education for policymakers to understand that even though Thucydides trap talks about the eventuality of war, that it can be avoided. And then the other piece of that is we look at China, we look at China's rise. what's the real intent? So if we think about moving past a unipolar moment into multipolarity, is that something that China will be content with? Or is this a transition period where they see themselves moving into a unipolar moment where China has the lead? And then it gets back to really kind of the ancient Chinese history when they were really the middle kingdom in the center of the universe. So the other part is think about context. So the operational environment, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. I'm going to kind of list those out, and then I'll go back and unpack a couple of those. So let me give you a couple of things to think about in terms of context of the world that we're in right now. Think about the speed of human interaction and the compressing of decision cycles for senior leaders. Great power competition. Now, that really got its traction coming out of the National Defense Strategy penned by Secretary Mattis, but really great power competition is across all the instruments of power. Emerging technologies. Now, you hear the phrase come out a lot of times, it's emerging disruptive technologies. Well, a lot of those disruptive technologies are enablers in their dual use, and we'll unpack that a little bit as well. Advanced weapons and weapons of mass destruction, or the Internet of Things. And then we can talk a little bit about solar winds and the fact that the way things are just hooked into the world now, virtually anything is hackable. And then the last one is deterrence. And we can come back a little bit to what Chris talked about with regards to the strikes that took place in Syria and kind of the theory of deterrence and how we think about that in today's environment. So let me unpack a couple of those points. First, let me get to the speed of human interaction and the compression of a decision-making cycle. Think about the pandemic. Think about how quickly you can recognize a problem, how quickly you put a plan together, and how quickly you can take action. And everybody's familiar with the time we declared the pandemic in March, when we probably knew about that anywhere from 30 to 60 days before that, as the information was coming out, and then the actions that we took place. And it really gave a good demonstration of how interconnected we are as a world. But I think another good example is one, and I got to go back to 1963. So in 1963, there was a South Vietnamese monk who engaged in an act of self-immolation. He set himself on fire in protest against the Diem regime. And most baby boomers and people my age remember that because the photo was on the cover of Life magazine. The Australian reporter won a Pulitzer Prize for the work he did on that story. But nothing really changed. Nothing really changed in South Vietnam, and it would be months later that actually Diem was assassinated. So fast forward 37 years to 2010, and you get a similar act. In this case, it's a vegetable vendor in Tunisia, a guy named Mohamed Bouazizi, who engages in the same act of self-immolation. And many will say that that is actually the spark, literally, that started the Arab Spring. So you get a sense of that interconnectedness and how fast things will move and how quickly that moved across Africa into the Gulf states. And then we still see the war that's raging in Syria. Great power competition. So we talked about it having really the birth in the NDS, but it's more than the M. And even if you're steeped in deep in the M and the dime, you have a supporting role to all those other instruments of power. And so years ago, I had a chance to talk at a dinner at NSA. And the example that I gave was the Joint Staff J2 at the time was Mike Groen. So Mike Groen goes in and he has his morning meeting with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It will be a very unsatisfying conversation if the only thing Mike talks about is the M and the dime, because there are impacts in those other instruments of power that will impact the military. And we have to stay ahead of that well in advance of some of the moves that our adversaries make. And so the example that I like to use, and I'll bring a little bit of a prop in here and I'm going to hold this up, is the Rubik's Cube, right? So I can walk in and say, in the national instruments of power, I've solved for green. Okay, well, that's impressive, but as a nation, as we think across the dime, we have to solve all six sides, understanding the problem that we're going after, and we have to do that simultaneously in time. And so that's a very interesting challenge for all of us. So let me kind of go into another piece of that, which is another aspect of the dime is the economics. So we see the Belt and Road Initiative. We see what's playing out there. The other part is the competition as it plays out in disinformation. And I think a good example of that was a comment that was made by General Nakasone on a forum where he was asked, what's the thing you are most concerned about? And he said disinformation, the inability to get the truth out there and how that information will cause others to act. And it's kind of interesting because, you've got the ability to put this out via bots and other ways to push information out that can go global in scale and reach. And we look at this and we think so many times, well, this is new. Well, it's not really new. The character war has changed in terms of the fact that you can push this out, but the strategy hasn't changed. This has been something that's in the Soviet DNA, it was in the Russian DNA. And what I want to do is read an interesting quote for you that was written a few years ago. And so listen to this. It said, our adversaries seek through covert means to disrupt national self-confidence, to hamstring measures of national defense, to increase social and industrial unrest, to stimulate all forms of disunity. Poor will be set against rich, Black against white, young against old, newcomers against established residents. So that sounds like it could come out of the headlines. It was actually written in 1947 by George Kennan. So if you think about Kennan, the long telegram, the sources of Soviet conduct, this is nothing new. It's just the means by which it's delivered is on a much broader scale. So let me talk a little bit about disruptive and enabling technologies. And these are really societal issues that we're facing now and will face over the next decade. So quantum, the race to really tackle quantum from a sensing standpoint, from communication, and from a computing standpoint as well, will all be integral to who gets there first. Because when you think about the problems quantum can solve, think about modeling and simulation, research and development, it will give us insights that we may not even anticipate on things that we can develop and capabilities. The other big piece is artificial intelligence. We have a lot of capability now that's in the narrow AI, machine learning, computer vision, but really kind of the race is how do we get to that cognition that really replicates human judgment, the human thought process, really general intelligence. And the debate that we're having right now is, first, how do we get more AI into our systems? And then how do we account for bias? How do we account for ethical decisions? And then we think about who's in the loop and who's not in the loop on those decisions. We've been very adamant in the discussions we have about nuclear capability that we will not put anything subject to an artificial intelligence decision, that anything that's nuclear will have a human in the loop. There's a great book called An Army of None that lays out a lot of this. And we talk about either in the loop, on the loop, or out of the loop. And Chris brought up a great example of Able Archer, which was an exercise that took place back in 1983 in the fall. But there's another story that happened a few months earlier. And if you Google the man who saved the world, you'll see the story of an individual by the name of Stanislav Petrov. And Stanislav was on watch. He was a Soviet air defense officer. He was a lieutenant colonel at the time. And so here's the context for what happened. 1 September, a Korean airliner of all nomenclatures, it was flight 007, had left Alaska and it had strayed into Soviet airspace. The Soviets shot the Korean airliner down. Nearly 300 people were killed, to include a US congressman. So go forward about 3 weeks further. Stanislav Petrov is on duty. And so he's in the watch center just outside of Moscow. They see an ICBM alert. There is an ICBM that's inbound. And he's looking at this thinking, okay, the tensions are pretty high. We've shot down a Korean airliner. And they've got this new system in place that's, it starts this process of saying, we've got this alert. And then he's got his protocol and drill of things that he has to do to put in motion the notifications for the counterstrike. But he looks at this and he applies judgment because there's only one missile coming his way. And he's thinking, if the US is going to, if this is the mutual assured destruction, it's not going to be one ICBM. So he starts to question what he's seeing from the technology. And then he sees 4 more ICBMs that are launched. and he goes around and he looks for corroboration, but eventually he finds that he thinks this is just an anomaly in the notification, and he chooses not to do anything. It was the right choice. And he's attributed in the story, and you can see this if you Google the man who saved the world, Stanislav Petrov, a fascinating story, and then go forward a couple of months to Able Archer, and you can see the tensions that are in place. And we can talk a little bit about that in deterrence theory of what's taking place at that time. Weapons of mass destruction, not just nuclear weapons. So think of all that's being developed right now in the terms of advanced technologies. And over the last couple of decades, we've been very fortunate that as we've been in Afghanistan and Iraq, we've not really been contested other than really on the ground domain and to some degree in aviation. Now we're contested in all those domains as we think about what great power war would look like. And there's a multitude of things that are coming out. Hypersonics, hypersonic glide vehicles, directed energy weapons, lasers, anti-satellite capabilities, co-orbital weapons that could actually go up and damage the satellites, electronic warfare, bio and synthetic biology. Just some incredible capabilities that will be enablers, but at the same time can be very, very disruptive. And they've studied our way of war, and the way they're going to come after us is in a very asymmetric way. So let me move to the Internet of Things. First and foremost, everybody's tracking solar winds, but imagine if solar winds would have taken place in the banking, in our power grids, in our industrial control systems, and some of our key command and control networks to disable them. And then the dialogue that we have right now, because when you get an event like this, somebody immediately says, well, this is an act of war. So what's an act of war in cyber? And does it conform to the norms of the laws of warfare? Does it have to be something that's destructive? Does it have to cause the loss of life? And it's something that's being debated right now, what really is an act of war. And how do we think about it? You know, it's one thing you can say, you put the Maginot Line in, as you put the moat, you kind of have your defensive capabilities, but I think more and more what we're going to start talking about is how we hunt in our own networks to find our adversaries. And then the last topic, let me talk a little bit about deterrence and deterrence theory. So deterrence theory kind of rests on three legs, right? You impose cost, you deny benefit, and you have to be very unambiguous in how you message that to your adversary. So think about deterrence in the context of a strike into Syria and what that means to the Iranians. And what does deterrence, you know, because that theory is kind of promulgated on the nuclear triad, what's taken place through the Cold War. So that was a very high bar in which somebody would engage in actions that would lead us to World War III. What does deterrence look like in hybrid warfare? What does deterrence look like in cyber? And what do those red lines look like? And where is the risk? Because I would tell you the risk is much lower in what our adversaries are willing to do. And there's an interesting context also that's taking place in a comment that was made several years ago by a senior leader where he said, it's interesting that these days that our adversaries still respect us, but they no longer fear us. And that is a significant change. So briefly, let me talk about some of the challenges with the IC and then I'll wrap up. So what are the challenges the IC, the intelligence community, faces today and moving into the future? An incredible explosion of information. More information than we can ever deal with unless we put the tools in place, the artificial intelligence, the machine learning, to help us garner insights to be able to help senior leaders make decisions. And the other interesting thing, and there's a great article in Foreign Affairs, and there's a great study from the Center for Strategic and International Studies on reimagining intelligence, is how much of the things that we traditionally did behind the skiffs and very classified and very sensitive rooms is now available to industry, to commercial businesses. How much imagery is available and, you know, geospatial intelligence is available from commercial firms, how much can be aggregated in social media, how much we can understand about what adversaries are doing just because of the sheer availability of information. And so as we think about the opportunities and challenges for the IC, a lot of that gets into how do we apply artificial intelligence through the entire intelligence cycle, from the tasking right on the sensor down to the desk of the analyst. How do we leverage public available information? And, you know, that CSI study does a great job of laying out, there's over 100 recommendations, and we're already in that space. We're already leveraging public available information but it's going to be a bigger part of what we do, and more tools are going to be required as we go forward. And the other part is we have to think about redundancy, resiliency, and security, and how we build out those capabilities as we think about peacetime, hybrid, and major combat operations. And that has to be applied to the ISR platforms, those intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms that we operated that weren't really challenged as much in a counterterrorism fight as they will be in multi-domain major combat operations. And if you're following DoD right now, you're seeing all things about JADC2. You know, how do we do command and control across the services and move information? It really is about decision advantage. Matter of fact, the Army's got a new term they're talking about decision dominance, and what the chief is sharing with the leaders. But AI is an enabler. It's not a thing unto itself. It is an enabler for those systems, for those architectures that are put in place. And so what we really have to do as an intelligence community is always challenge all the disciplines that we have in place. We cannot rest on our laurels. So whether it's HUMINT, SIGINT, open source, GEOINT, you have to look at what can we do, how can technology be used to our advantage. And then the last piece of that is partners. No partner left behind. You know, we talk about being more sharing of intelligence, but it's not just sharing of intelligence with partners, and that's a key part of the national defense strategy is, you know, opening those relationships, expanding with partners and allies. But it's not just sharing of intelligence, it's more integration at the operational level that we're going to have to be able to do that with like-minded nations and some very non-traditional partners. And this is the Spy Museum, so for all the technology and all the things that are out there, there is still a job for 007. He still will be gainfully employed. I will just tell you that his task in the world of ubiquitous technical surveillance is going to be a little bit harder, and it's going to be a little bit more expensive, but there's still a lot of things that the 007 has to do. And I kind of use the analogy of, you know, kind of tools, clubs in the golf bag, right? So you don't want to go in the sand trap, but when you end up in the sand trap, you're not going to pull out that big Bertha driver. You're going to pull out a very surgical club. You're going to get your wedge, your sand wedge, to get you out of the sand. And HUMINT still has that value in what it means as we build our strategy. So let me get back to my first point. What's the problem we're trying to solve? It's how do we sustain the current rules-based order of democratic values to foster prosperity among nations and prevent great power war? And it really is a whole of society issue. And there will be a lot of those that say, well, really, World War III, that will never happen. We are so interconnected as nations in globalization that it would never happen. It would be futile. No one would win. Well, there's a book titled The Great Illusion. It's called The Great Illusion, a study in the relation of military power to national advantage. And it was written by a guy named Norman Angell. And there's a quote from the book that says just what I said. Economic interdependence has made war an illusion, futile. The interesting point is Norman wrote that book in 1909, 5 years before World War I, where his position was this could never happen. And in the last century, we saw 2 world wars. So as Thucydides wrote about the nature of war, he said it is a violent act between nations, between humans. It is about fear, honor, and interest. And that is immutable. It is not changed. Nations will act in their own national interests. As I see all of those things that are developing in that fabric of what is taking place in the world, this next decade will be absolutely critical as we think about that physics problem, where we have to apply pressure to continue that values-based world order that we've enjoyed over the last 70 years. And with that, Chris, back to you, and I look forward to your questions.
Go ahead, Amanda. We'll go ahead and take those questions. Thank you, Bob.
And I really want to say, I think this was one of our most surprising spy chats. There were so many fun 1909, you know, and the Rubik's Cube. So anyway, thank you for all these surprising additions to such serious subject matter and making us look at this through a historical context, which I love as a museum person. We got lots of their Able Archer always really resonates with people. And before you had even mentioned the Korean incident as well, someone had brought it up in the Q&A. And And so the question with these tests and these near misses, how do we ensure that if we're sending a message, that the one we are sending is the one that is received?
Yeah, let me take a quick jump at that because it's kind of interesting. One of the things that, as you look at these big exercises like Able Archer, whether you have a demonstration or something in that context, it's okay. I mean, you want to make sure that you're unambiguous. So you want to let the Russians know that this is what we're doing. This is a nature exercise. And oh, by the way, in the context of Able Archer, if you look back at the article Chris spoke about, it's a little bit bigger than it had been in the past. So you let them know, hey, normally you see there's 20 aircraft in 5 nations. Just want to let you know this year there's 25 aircraft and there's 15 nations, so that they're aware of it. And in some cases, right now the relationship obviously is far more tenuous for the Russians, given the fact that the ambassador in Washington, because of the comments of POTUS, has been recalled. But in some cases, just to be able to observe, you may, when relationships are a little bit better, you would bring in observers to go, hey, we want you to see what we're doing. Some of the major exercises the Russians have had over the last couple of days, Kavkaz, for example, they bring in observers to be able to see what they're doing. And part of that is messaging. It's a demonstration of capability, but it's also to make sure that you understand the nature of what's taking place and that you're not misunderstood and you don't have an Able Archer kind of false alarm.
Another question about the 1983 incident. Was President Reagan involved, and did that further, up the ante that he was, on site, and then made a joke about the bombing will start shortly? Is that a credible story?
So I'll jump in, and then I'm sure Bob can address the question. First of all, thanks for the question. So I don't know if Reagan was directly involved with Able Archer, but I can underscore the point that Reagan's bellicose rhetoric at times, what you just referred to as a quip that he made, but at the same time, he was offering rhetoric, he was sending some unintended signals to the Soviet Union. And I really appreciated Bob's comments on human intelligence, because at the time, a source by the name of Godlewski, a colonel, was recruited by British intelligence. And Godlewski was reinforcing, if I remember the book about Godlewski, he was a colonel in the GRU. He was recruited by British intelligence, and there was a joint operation. He kept reinforcing the point that the rhetoric was scaring the Soviet Union. So the idea of having well-placed human sources to give us some back-channel thinking was invaluable. That said, it didn't prevent a scare in 1983. So we have to be really cognizant of unintended signals. And that's, to Bob's point, that includes making sure you have some kind of communications with would-be adversaries, that you're able to pick up a phone like we do in Syria and talk to the Russians, so there isn't a miscalculation, so that there aren't unintended casualties on the battle space. Of course, Russia was notified before the Syria strikes. Now, they were not happy because they thought they were only notified a few minutes prior to the strikes in Syria. Nonetheless, they were notified. So I'll turn it back to Bob, but I really appreciate the question.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And Chris has good insights from his time on the NSC. You do want to have those back channel conversations, but you also, sometimes what is said publicly, in this case, you get kind of an off the cuff remark from the president, is you really have to understand the culture. And so one of the things I think we did, or we had a bigger bench back in the day, were people that understood the Soviets, that understood the Russian culture. That bench, and there's some great ones out there. Matter of fact, anything Matt Pottinger writes on China, I'm going to go read. But that bench, there's not a lot of Matts out there, as many as we would like, that are providing those insights. So a lot of times, what's messaged out is there's an intent behind that, and there's behind the scenes communications. So those messages that go out, there's people that are in key positions that are to say, this is really what the Americans meant by what they sent in that particular correspondence. But you got to have those emergency communications where you can de-escalate. which gets into, we talked about the deterrence piece right there. You can, if you watch what takes place between the Israelis and the Iranians in Syria, right? At what point does that become a red line that gets into an escalatory, tit for tat that that kind of spins beyond what either side intended to take place? And it's a very, very interesting exchange that takes place in Syria and some of the events along the Levant.
Chris, that makes me think of, we're going to have a very small show of some gems from the National Cryptologic Museum. So things from the NSA, and one of them is kind of the hotline, if I'm not incorrect, between the West and Moscow, and it's a teletype, right? Is that correct? So you can actually see the hotline if you come to the museum in a few weeks. So anyway.
That's exactly right. And that reinforces the point that Bob and I have made, the idea of engaging with your would-be adversaries. So if there are tensions, you can de-escalate those tensions. And as I said, a real example, it's open source, it's available to the public to see, is the fact that there is dialogue, there are open lines of communications with U.S. military forces and the Russians on the ground in Syria to prevent escalation needlessly. So we did that throughout the Cold War. I remember the late Admiral Crowe talked about that on 60 Minutes, I believe. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a naval admiral. I remember him talking about the importance of having that relationship with his counterparts. And I think he made the point, it's not a telephone, as I recall. Now I'm dating myself. This was the 1980s. But the reason it wasn't a phone call is because, again, you don't want to misinterpret what you're talking about. So there's an accurate record. So there's a teletype or some way of capturing exactly what was said.
Yeah, if I got to handle that, Amanda, before we go to the next question, really is our attaché corps. Right. So not only the State Department, but the defense attaches. So we're in about 180 some countries where we have a presence, and that's part and parcel to what they do every day, which is to engage with their various counterparts when there is tension, when there is something like a strike, to be able to have a de-escalatory conversation under the ambassador, under the POLAD, or under someone in the Defense Department from the attaches. And it's interesting that I was watching the news last night on the BBC. They were talking about the Chinese presence. And we talk about China's, thinking much more globally. They literally have, if the fact is correct that this gentleman spoke about, they now have more attaché representation in the 193 or 94 countries globally than the US does.
We have actually a tip to share before we leave. Abel Archer, one of our guests, recommends the fictional series Deutschland 83 that I have heard a lot of good stuff about too, but Abel Archer is engaged on that, but fictionally. So I thought I'd throw that out there because I know we're still looking for things to watch. Some of us, we're not quite out of the woods yet. All right, now you have both touched on the fact that this next question was about, human intelligence. Is it going away? And you both addressed that it's not going away. It's still very needed. But do you think, despite the fact that you feel there's still the need for human intelligence officers, are we going to see a larger focus on really broad hacks and data collection? Is that just going to be more of what we do, and maybe the human intelligence is going to be more of a surgical operation?
Chris, I'll let you jump on that one first.
All right, thanks, Bob. I appreciate the opportunity to answer that question. I think we're always going to have to go back to what Bob said, and it warms my heart because he knows all of the ends. My business was counterintelligence and human intelligence, and I'm very partial to that. Bob understands all those systems, but he hit the right word and the right message by saying surgical. There'll always be a need for that human source, because you can't divine a nation's intentions unless you have access to the inner workings, maybe, of that foreign leadership. So human intelligence is always going to be needed to to answer those critical questions that can't be answered by cyber hacks, that can't be answered by signals intelligence or imagery intelligence. So we're always going to have access to human intelligence, albeit it's the most risky, arguably. But yes, I just will close out that question from my vantage point by underscoring the idea of getting in the back door into a department agency, like Bob talked about solar winds. That is a foreign intelligence collection operation. There's no need to have a human source when you can enter into a back door through a security update, and then all of a sudden stay in the department and the agency in the United States and really be in somebody's department and agency stealing whatever it is you need to steal. So cyber certainly is going to continue to expand, and defensive cyber is going to have to behave commensurately. Bob?
Yeah, so Chris brings up a great point. We talk about risk. And under an environment that we are right now, and we kind of characterize that as ubiquitous technical surveillance, and think of really all the cameras and things that, you know, the Chinese are helping enable through the concept of smart cities, safe cities that are existing globally. So the ability to move around, to operate in traditional spycraft that we've done over, I won't say decades, you know, because some of the fundamentals of spycraft are centuries old, is still a key means by which we gather information. But Chris articulated very well in terms of the risk calculus, right? If you can get it in a less intrusive or a less risky way, then that's the way you could go. But if it is something that you're only going to get by a certain means, then you have to think about what's the risk involved, because it is inherently up close and personal for those that are involved in human intelligence, and it is not without risk. And we've seen that. And both as it's been applied against us from a counterintelligence standpoint and the strategy that we put in place. And one of the things that we have to do is, you know, how much of the risk can we mitigate? And then you need policymakers that are willing to, that fully understand it, and that are willing to use that capability and not just leave it on a shelf.
So given which you know very well, Bob, given the current vast structure of the American intelligence community, this guest wants to know, how quickly can we coordinate all those community members in an unforeseen crisis situation?
So there is great communication across all the agencies. Matter of fact, when there's a crisis, depending on what it is, if it's mostly within defense or the larger IC, the community comes together, senior leaders, working groups. So there is good interaction across the agencies. I've never thought that there's a concern there. I think one of the things that we have to think about from the broader IC is when we look at resources, when we look at how we build out capability, we need to be able to build capability as an enterprise. So we can't build capability as a discrete 18 organizations. So we got to look at where's commonality, where investments are being made in certain agencies can be leveraged by others. So for me, as I think about kind of our moving ahead, it's how do we come together as a community to build the most efficient and effective enterprise that can answer not only the questions for national security, but for the Defense Department as well. But one of the things that I've enjoyed, having been, you know, the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and we all kind of go to battle for budgets and all that good stuff, is there is a strong sense of camaraderie of solving problems on behalf of the nation. And I've always felt very, very good about my ability to sit at the XCOM with the other heads of the agencies and talk about the problems we have to solve and how we get to the best solution.
Gosh, we have so many excellent and diverse questions. It's killing me to pick and choose these, but I've got to ask if you have any comments on whether the president calling Putin a killer, do you think that was a gaffe or premeditated? Any thoughts that you might want to share on that?
So Chris, I'll let you have that one, because even though I have retired the uniform, I will stay in my IC lane.
I truly do not know if it was a deliberate comment or not. I just don't have any sense for that. I saw it play out last evening. Clearly, what it has done is it sent a very strong message to Russia. It creates an adversary climate right now. So it's going to ratchet up tensions. It's certainly going to cause diplomatic tensions worldwide. Clearly, we sent some strong signals to Saudi Arabia with the way the United States has chosen to very deliberately handle or not handle, depending on your perspective, MBS. I just think that the administration had already signaled a much tougher stance toward Russia. So I don't know if that comment was deliberate or not, but it's certainly going to create tensions worldwide for our diplomats dealing with embassies, really across the world where there's a Russian counterpart across the capital of some state in Western Europe. So it's clearly going to be tough to navigate, but the administration did set out to be very muscular in its approach toward Putin. So that arguably is very much a counter to the way the previous administration handled Russia. Although they would probably argue that there were a lot of sanctions placed on Russia, we continue to sanction them, and we are continuing a tougher hardline policy. But I really don't have a sense whether that was deliberate or not, but it is going to cause problems diplomatically.
Yeah, so what I would add onto that is, so that becomes an indications and warning issue for the IC. So, okay, now what are the Russians going to do? Are they going to do something that's very aggressive in nature? And so now, the sensitivity that I see from a collection standpoint is looking at what reactions might the Russians have from an indications and warning standpoint so that they can get ahead of those potential moves for policymakers.
Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in one enormous question, but in a tiny amount of space, and that is about space intelligence. How robust is our preparedness for the Chinese and Russian to engage in modern warfare with space-based capabilities? Any thoughts based on your past experience about what that might look like, and are we ready?
So I won't talk about readiness because I wouldn't get into a vulnerability that we have or do not have in space, but just to tell you that, China is interested in being a significant player in space. A couple of years ago, the deputy under the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, Kerry Bingen, asked us at DIA, hey, we want to make sure that we're able to capture in a public forum an understanding of where the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and the North Koreans are in terms of their investments to be able to challenge us in space. And as I looked at that, I thought, boy, there's probably not a whole lot we can get at an unclassified level to get that out for policymakers and for the general public. Turns out we put out a pamphlet of 30 pages called Challenges in Space. You can go to Amazon because there's some entrepreneurial individual has decided to download it and they're selling it. So if you want to spend $30 on it, it's out there, but Challenges in Space. And so what it does is it lays out, hey, here's the capabilities and some of the things that I talked about earlier. They put up their own GPS, so whether it's BeiDou or GLONASS, the Russians have their own backup in GPS. The Chinese are putting up their own internet system. They want to be as independent, self-reliant as they can. ASATs, right? Anti-satellite missiles that go up and destroy your satellite. China has it. Russia has it. The Indians tested it a couple of years ago and created a debris field. So the fact that we're being challenged in space is nothing new, and that's only going to increase. And one of the really things that's is problematic is I think there's 5 treaties that exist for operations in space. And one of the big ones is you can't put a weapon of mass destruction in space, but it doesn't say anything about electronic warfare, co-orbital satellites, and things that could actually do damage to your infrastructure in space. And so I think one of the areas, much we talk about reduction in nuclear weapons, we talk about New START, things like that. We really need to have a serious dialogue about how we regulate what is taking place in space, because the democratization of space will only increase and more nations will have assets that are circling the globe.
Anything you want to add into the space war, Chris?
No, I think Bob did a comprehensive job of that, but I do want to take just a second to again thank Bob. I can't believe an hour has just gone by. For me, this has been extraordinary to be reconnected to a good friend, somebody that I would have followed, like I said, anywhere, someone who was a better student than I was at Command General Staff College, obviously. So everyone got a chance to see my former peer and retired Lieutenant General Bob Ashley, who led DIA admirably. And I saw it firsthand when Bob invited me back to DIA headquarters. So thanks, Bob. Really excited about this program. Thanks, Amanda. Thanks to our sponsors. This was a great spy chat. I really enjoyed it.
Hey, Chris, thanks so much, and to your team, and thanks to Accenture, and thanks again, because you did come over and talk to the team about your experiences on the CT side and on being on the National Security Council. So thanks so much for that, and always appreciate the friendship, and I know it will go for many years to come.
Thanks,
I
Bob.
want our wonderful guests to know that we will share the questions, the many questions we didn't get to with Chris and Bob, and who knows, maybe you will hear from them and they will also get some of the love that was sent through the questions from old friends. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for being here, Bob and Chris, our audience. Thank you to Accenture Federal Services. You are just amazing. And if you'd like being here and you feel like donating to the Spy Museum's Mission Resilience campaign, we would sure appreciate that, because that's how we keep beaming out to everyone during the pandemic, and we'll keep doing this after the pandemic, because we are reaching folks that we wouldn't see otherwise, and we love doing that. Next month we have a spy chat on April 15th. There's also a cool program on April 7th about spy sites of Philly, but also keep your eyes peeled at our website, because we might have a really cool and unique offer available for a limited time. Can't say any more about that. So make sure you're a subscriber to our emails, and don't be a stranger. We really appreciate everyone. Thanks. Bye.